With the Mandalorian and Grogu movie hitting theaters this past week, I figured there's no better time to go deep on something that shapes everything we know about Din Djarin, the Mandalorian Creed. Because if you really want to understand Mando, you have to understand the code that he lives by. It drives every decision he makes, and it's why he's so protective over Grogu. And honestly, I think it makes him one of the most compelling characters in all of Star Wars. And on the surface, Mando looks like your typical really cool character. He doesn't talk much, he works alone, and he gets the job done. But the more you understand the creed he follows, the more you realize that there is nothing really simple about this guy. Every choice he makes traces back to a set of values that were drilled into him from childhood. So today we're going deep into the lore, we're going to break down everything we know about the Mandalorian way, where it came from, what it demands, and why it matters so much to Din Djarin's story. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, before we get into the creed itself, we have to talk about who the Mandalorians actually are, because their culture runs deep. The Mandalorians are one of the oldest civilizations in the galaxy. Their history stretches back way over 1,000 years before the events of the Phantom Menace. We're talking about a people who were building warrior societies while most of the galaxy was still figuring itself out. And from the very beginning of their inception, their way of life was built around two things: honor and war. And that's not an exaggeration. War wasn't just something that happened to the Mandalorians. It was also woven into their identities. And nothing reflects that better than how seriously they take their armor. Every Mandalorian spends months, sometimes years, crafting the perfect suit for themselves. This isn't just something that was mass-produced, and it's not assigned to them. Every piece is personal, designed, built, and refined to reflect exactly who that Mandalorian is. When you look at a Mandalorian's armor, you're also looking at their personalities. It was crafted to fit them perfectly as a fighter. It matched their specific skills and was designed to maximize their style of movement. It's a statement of who they are just as much as a piece of protection. And in addition to their armor, they also get a rigorous amount of training. From a very young age, Mandalorian children were put through intense combat and weapons training. Think about how the Jedi Order took in younglings and spent years shaping them into warriors of the Force. The Mandalorians did the same thing, but instead of the Force, they had an arsenal of some of the most advanced weaponry in the galaxy. From blasters, flamethrowers, jetpacks, whistling birds, vibroblades, you name it, a Mandalorian has probably trained with it. But it wasn't just weapons. Mandalorians were taught tracking, strategy, pattern recognition, and survival in the harshest conditions imaginable. They trained their entire lives to be as sharp and as dangerous as possible. And that relentless dedication to their craft is exactly why Mandalorians built the reputation that they did across the galaxy. They were elite fighters, master tacticians, and the most feared bounty hunter that credits could buy. Mandalorians became known as some of the most valuable allies that you could possibly have. But here's what a lot of people miss about Mandalorian culture. It wasn't just about individual skill. In fact, some of the most important parts of the Mandalorian way had nothing to do with fighting at all. Mandalorian society was organized into houses, noble family names that had serious political and social power on Mandalore. And this system defined everything. You were either born into one of those houses, or you were pledging loyal to one. Your house was your identity almost as much as your armor was. The pride Mandalorians felt for their family name, their faction, and their people, that ran as deep as just about anything else in their culture. Some of the most legendary names in Mandalorian history come from these houses. House Vizsla, for example, one of the most powerful and storied families on Mandalore. They produced warriors, leaders, and eventually, their descendants were founders of Death Watch. The Darksaber, which becomes so central to Mandalorian politics throughout the Clone Wars, and into the Mandalorian series, it was originally created by Vizsla, the first Mandalorian to ever become a Jedi. And that weapon became a symbol of Mandalorian leadership. Whoever wielded the Darksaber had legitimate claim to rule Mandalore. That's how deeply these families' legacies shaped their entire planet's history. And because Mandalorians were so passionate and prideful of their culture, they believed that strength and skill determined your worth. And that intensity very often turned inward. The Mandalorians fought each other constantly, and just as viciously as they fought outsiders. There were constant power struggles over who should lead Mandalore, whose house deserved dominance, and what direction the culture should move in. It was a civilization that almost couldn't help but clash with itself. And that internal conflict eventually came to head in the most dramatic way possible. The biggest example of Mandalorian infighting that we see in the Star Wars timeline happens during the Clone Wars era, and it nearly destroyed everything. A radical faction rose up calling themselves Death Watch. Their whole ideology was that Mandalore had gone soft. The current government, led by Duchess Satine Kryze, had pushed Mandalore towards pacifism and diplomacy, and Death Watch absolutely despised that. They believed Mandalore's identity was built on war, and abandoning that was a betrayal of everything their ancestors stood for. So they launched a political uprising, stirring up chaos across the planet, assassinating political rivals, and trying to seize power by force. Things got so destabilized that the Jedi Council had to send in Jedi to help restore order. Death Watch was eventually pushed back, but they were far from finished. Regrouping in exile, Death Watch eventually aligned with one of the most dangerous beings in the galaxy, Maul. Together, they formed the Shadow Collective, an organization that combined the Mandalorian warriors of Death Watch with Maul's incredible power. This was no longer just a political faction, it was a galactic power play. With the Shadow Collective's backing, Death Watch and Maul launched a full takeover of Mandalore. They actually succeeded. For a period of time, Maul ruled Mandalore with Death Watch enforcing his will. The Jedi had to intervene again. This time, Ahsoka Tano led the siege of Mandalore alongside a clone army in what became one of the most harrowing battles in the entire Clone Wars. And then, right in the middle of all that chaos, Order 66 happened. The clone troopers turned on Ahsoka, and the Republic became the Empire overnight. And Mandalore, a planet that was already fractured and trying to rebuild itself, now had to face an entirely new threat. The Empire moved in, and through a combination of political pressure and military force, Mandalore became an Imperial-controlled world. The planet that had survived 1,000 years of its own wars, brought to its knees by a galaxy-wide shift in power that no one saw coming. But here's where it gets really interesting. Not every Mandalorian surrendered. Not every Mandalorian bent the knee to the Empire. This group was called the Children of the Watch, and they are the key to understanding everything about Din Djarin. The Children of the Watch were actually descended from Death Watch, the very faction that had caused so much chaos on Mandalore. But this wasn't the violent, conquest-driven Death Watch of the Clone Wars. This was a splinter group that had turned away from all of that. They retreated inwards and went back to basics. They dedicated themselves to the oldest, most traditional version of the Mandalorian Code. They called it the Way of the Mandalore, and they followed it with absolute, unwavering devotion. No exceptions, no compromises. Every rule was sacred. Every part of the creed was law. So how did this relatively small group of people survive an entire era of the Empire when the rest of Mandalore was crumbling around them? Two things: skill and community. The Children of the Watch had all the combat training and warrior values of traditional Mandalorians. They were dangerous, resourceful, and fully capable. But more than that, they had a tight-knit tribal structure that made them function as a true collective. This wasn't just a loose alliance of warriors. This was a family. They protected each other, and every single member of the covert understood that their survival depended on everyone else. And at the core of that community, above everything else, was the protection of their foundlings. And this is where the whole story of Din and Grogu finally clicks into place. The Children of the Watch held one belief above all else. The next generation is the future. Foundlings were treated as sacred. It didn't matter where you came from, what planet or what species. If you were a foundling taken in by the covert, you were Mandalorian, and you were part of the family. And the covert didn't just say that. They fully lived it. They invested an enormous amount of resources into training and raising their foundlings, giving them armor, teaching them the creed, and eventually bringing them in as full members of the group. Foundlings weren't charity cases. They were the future warriors and future protectors, and the future of the Mandalorian way itself. Din Djarin was one of those foundlings. As a child, Din was caught in the crossfires of a separatist attack. His parents were killed, and he was alone, with battle droids closing in. And then, in what must have felt like a miracle, a Mandalorian warrior descended from the sky and pulled him out of danger. The covert took him in, and they raised him. They gave him armor and a purpose and family. Everything Din Djarin is, every value and instinct, every decision he makes, it comes from that moment and everything that followed. So when we get to season 1 and Din completes his bounty, and hands Grogu over to Moff Gideon's people, he immediately turns around and risks everything to go back for him. People who don't know the Creed might misread that as a simple change of heart, but that's not what was happening at all. What was happening is that Din looked at Grogu, small, alone, and afraid, and he saw himself. He saw the kid he used to be. He saw a foundling. And everything the Mandalorian way taught him led him to the only correct answer. You protect the foundlings. That's not optional. It's not a suggestion. That is the way. And it wasn't just Din who felt that. His entire covert, every Mandalorian in the underground forge, came out fighting to protect Grogu. They sacrificed their secrecy, their safety, and their home. Because protecting a foundling is not a personal choice in the Children of the Watch. It's a collective obligation. The whole group fights and protects the foundlings. Because the whole group understands that the foundlings are the future. And without a future, the way dies with them. Now let's talk about probably the most iconic part of the Mandalorian Creed. The rule that defines Din Djarin's entire on-screen presence. The helmet. Once a foundling is old enough to speak the Creed, they are given a helmet forged from Beskar, the legendary Mandalorian steel. And from that moment forward, that helmet is a part of them. It doesn't come off, not in front of allies, and especially not in front of enemies. And the rules around this are about as strict as it can get. If an enemy removes your helmet and sees your face, every single witness must be eliminated. Your face is a vulnerability, and letting enemies know what you look like under your armor is a tactical and spiritual failure. And the only way to correct it is to ensure that no one who saw it lives to tell the tale. But even that pales in comparison to the other scenario. If you remove your helmet voluntarily, if you choose to show your face, then you're now an apostate. You're outcast from the covert. And the only way back to redemption is bathing in the living waters beneath Mandalore. These waters are a relic of ancient Mandalorian history, a spiritual site that the Creed treats as sacred and purifying. And we actually see this play out in Season 3, when Din, who removed his helmet to let Grogu see him one last time, had to go all the way back to a planet that was supposed to be uninhabitable. He descended into the mines to bathe in the living waters, so that he could be welcomed back to his covert. It's a powerful moment because it shows just how seriously Din takes all these rules, even when following them costs him everything. And that discomfort that we see whenever Din is without his helmet, that's not just shyness. That's a man who has lived his entire life with the belief that removing his helmet is wrong. In his armor, Din Djarin is the most confident and capable presence in any room. The moment the helmet comes off, though, he looks genuinely lost, like something vital had been taken from him. And honestly, when you understand what Beskar armor really is, that reaction makes complete sense. Beskar is not normal metal. It's extraordinarily rare and especially powerful. It can withstand direct blaster fire without a dent, and it can deflect a lightsaber blade. Most materials just don't do that. We see proof of this firsthand in Season 2, when the Razor Crest gets completely vaporized by an Imperial attack. The entire ship disintegrates in seconds, but when the smoke clears, lying in the wreckage, and still intact, is Din's pure Beskar spear, not a single scratch on it. For a people who have survived war after war and betrayal after betrayal, that armor is more than identity. It is one constant thing that can't be taken from you, and the one thing that keeps you alive when everything else fails. That's why the Children of the Watch wear it at all times. That's why the Creed treats it as sacred. And that's why every time Din puts his helmet back on, you can feel him exhale, because now he's home. The Mandalorians are one of the most layered and fascinating cultures that Star Wars has ever given us. And when you understand the Creed, every single thing that Din Djarin does makes perfect sense. He's a man living exactly according to his values, in a galaxy that constantly tests whether he can hold on to them. And getting another full movie centered on Din and Grogu, I think it's perfect for the franchise right now. The Skywalker saga will always be the foundation of Star Wars, but there are so many different characters that we can get stories from. Characters like Mando open up something a little different. Stories grounded in culture and loyalty, and in the question of what it actually means to live by a code. And I think there are a lot more stories here left to tell, and I can't wait what to see these two get up to. My full breakdown of the movie is coming very soon, so make sure you're subscribed and have notifications on so you don't miss it. If you liked the video, drop a like and leave a comment letting me know your favorite moment from the new movie. And I will see you guys in the next one. And just remember, this is the way.